Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. This week, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Meg Martin. Dr. Martin is an Associate Dean for Distance Education at Unity Environmental University and the Executive Director of PDX Wildlife, which works to improve conservation breeding for endangered species. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. This is one of my favorite topics of how we can use the science of sex to help endangered species. I think it's such a great topic to work on. And you've worked on so many different interesting organisms like pandas and otters and painted dogs. And I hope we can dig into all of those. Yes, it'll be fun.
Yeah, me too. I, of course, love it.
You
clearly.
Love it. Yes, it's all so good. And I've really admired your work because you've taken an evolutionary perspective to try to understand how we can improve conservation breeding. And so I was wondering if you could tell us just a little about before you came onto the scene of conservation breeding and kind of your generation of scientists, what was the typical approach to conservation breeding?
Yeah, so when I came on the scene, sort of genetics and the study of genetics had just exploded in sort of the 60s and 70s, and people were starting to apply the idea of genetics and inbreeding to conservation breeding settings or to saving endangered species. I mean, that's really when we also started a lot of these conservation breeding programs. So when I came on, everyone was very focused on that and reducing inbreeding and making sure that we had the best possible matches, which of course makes a lot of sense in conservation breeding programs, right? You are often starting with these super small populations. And so, for example, the pygmy rabbits that I started my work on, they had 16, the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbit had 16 individuals that we found
in the whole
as
world,
as the last surviving population for this subpopulation. So pygmy rabbits, there were quite a few in Idaho, right? But there's this subspecies in eastern Washington that is called the Columbia Basin subspecies, and they were technically sort of their own little thing. And so those guys were pulled into captivity by the Oregon Zoo, and that's who I did my master's with. And, there's 16 of them. And same with the condors. I think there was 18, right? And when you think of that in terms of, hey, we don't really know how these animals breed in the wild, and now we have 16, and it's not even 8 males and 8 females. Right, necessarily.
Yeah.
It's usually not that even split. And then you have to put everything together. So, of course, with that few individuals, we need to make certain that the genetics are really solid and that we're getting the most diversity that we can. And so traditionally, we've done that by pedigrees and genetic analysis and sort of did this Noah's Ark type pairing is what I like to call it, right? A female and a male, one-on-one. One-on-one. And, for lack of a better word, we put all of our eggs in one basket and you hoped that that female and that male would mate during that season. And if not, you kind of lost the opportunity. With pygmy rabbits, those guys really only breed for 2 to 3 years, maybe a little bit longer if you're lucky, but you have a very short sort of lifespan to get the preferred breeding that you have. And we were finding that that population just couldn't replace itself, basically. So that's where I entered, is that we very much were on the Noah Ark style of conservation breeding. And I just thought it was really funny that we were doing it that way because it felt like everything I'd learned about animal behavior and sexual selection and Darwin and all those things were just being thrown out the window. It's not like animals can do a genetic test or even there's lots of behavioral mechanisms that they use, scent MHC to potentially reduce their inbreeding in the wild, or, certain animals will leave, like all the females will disperse, for example, or something like that. So
there's these mechanisms to avoid inbreeding
in the wild, right?
Yeah.
But so it's there. I'm not saying it's not there, but we just kind of took it to an extreme in conservation breeding, it felt.
And was it that they tried to find the individuals that were most distant genetically from each other and mate those with each other? Is that sort of the model? Okay.
Right. And once we had them genetically matched, then we would just go by pedigree. So,
what does that mean?
Because we had 16.
Yeah. So what does going by pedigree mean?
Basically, that if we had a male and a female breed, that, we wouldn't necessarily want them to breed multiple times or multiple years in a row, because then they may have too many, depending on if the breeding was successful, and then their babies.
Okay.
Yeah. And if their babies survived, right. But then, of course, like a father wouldn't be bred to a daughter kind of thing.
Oh, gotcha.
So that's like pedigree breeding. Basically what people have done for, centuries
and then
with
you
agricultural
come on the scene
stock.
and you're like, you have this animal behavior background. We've talked a little in previous episodes about mate choice and things like that. And you're like, why would they just put one male and one female together? It sounds like, right? So can you expand on that?
Yeah, exactly. We have this entire science behind how peacocks have evolved, these massive tails to impress the female, and ways to display that, and behaviors to highlight, all of these different traits. And it felt like we really, were like, yeah, forget all of that. We're going to throw you in with a male. And we really sort of believed at that time that animals would pretty much breed if you put them in together in captivity. And why wouldn't we, right? There was agricultural science that kind of backed that up quite a bit, but those animals have been domesticated for a very, very long time. So I think the first time I realized it was actually I had an internship with the Smithsonian right out of undergraduate, and I went to China, and we were studying adolescent behavior of male bears, giant pandas that were coming, growing through their adolescence, but were coming into their first breeding seasons. And the way that they paired those animals was just this one-on-one, but they often, because bears are big and you don't have that much space, they would often bring up multiple males and multiple females to this one area of the zoo. And then they would, sort of introduce the one male and the one female through what we call like a howdy gate. So that's just like a mesh barrier where they get to say, they get to say howdy, they get to say hi. So we would introduce them, but simultaneously we may have, like sort of the female in the middle and one male on one side and another male on the other side. And that second male may not have even been a potential mate. But the female would, of course, be able to evaluate these two. It was the perfect dichotomous choice test, right? And your listeners may need to potentially know what dichotomous choice tests are.
Yeah, I was like, go on.
Just like it sounds, right? Dichotomy. So you have two tests, and basically you're asking an animal to choose between just two different objects or other animals in this case. So we had basically a male, female, male. And it was just like the perfect opportunistic research project, really. So they would put the female,
like by chance. They weren't doing
it
for conservation breeding. Oh, that's so funny.
Right. Yeah. They would bring them up just to have animals like all in one area, basically. And so I was starting to notice that sometimes behaviorally, the female was very, very into the other male, the alternate male, that may not have even been potential for mating. And sometimes that would decrease, or, well, I didn't know, right? But it seemed like it was potentially decreasing her motivation to mate with the male that we wanted to. And that kind of sparked the trajectory of my entire career, actually.
Wow. So if you had to summarize your kind of main research question, how would you phrase it?
I like to tell people as my elevator pitch, quote unquote, that I optimize conservation breeding programs through studying sexual motivation, mate choice, and behavioral compatibility for these endangered species. And I focus a lot on the behavioral and physiological mechanisms that influence that reproductive success in these conservation breeding programs.
Okay, so you had this aha moment, this light bulb go off when you were watching the female hanging out with this other male, and that kind of led you to this research question. So what happened from there in terms of your research?
Yeah, so that was actually before the Columbia Columbia Basin pygmy rabbits. During that internship, I decided I really wanted to study this. Clearly, the pandas were already set up to do that. So I contacted all of the giant panda experts that I knew that I had read about and learned their research during this internship and asked them if they were interested. And I think across the board, no one got back to me.
Gosh, that's hard. That's really discouraging. Yeah.
It was very, very discouraging. I went back to the Oregon Zoo and was interning with the Oregon Zoo for a little bit. And David Shepherdson, who was the conservation director at that time, he focused on welfare. And so I kind of managed to convince him to let me study this on the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbits so that I, could get him to take on my project. I coached it in terms of breeding welfare, right? Because we had done a lot of research and maybe, I don't want to say solved the problem, but felt like we had a good grasp on welfare of animals. But I said, yeah, except in these breeding situations, right? Where we don't give them a natural setting. We kind of just put them in these back pens together and it's smaller and it doesn't have that much enrichment and all of that. And the big one is the social enrichment, right? Because breeding is all about the social interaction. So I kind of coached it in that way. And he agreed to let me go ahead and start the project on the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbits.
So he took a chance on you.
He took a chance on me, yeah, and let me do my thing, which I did for about 2.5 years. And then it's funny, but I guess preference matters. And
so let's go over what you found with that study.
Yeah. So with the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbits, we did simple female choice. I wasn't looking at the males at all at this point. We just basically put female in the middle of 2 males, and
so just
I
like
measured
the pandas, right?
just like the pandas.
Yeah.
They were set up that way anyways. It turns out this is a very typical setup for conservation breeding programs. So all I did honestly was go in and they had already set everyone up for breeding, and I measured behaviors before the actual breeding of the females' behaviors towards each male on either side. And then before they bred, I analyzed whether or not they were preferred or not preferred, and just based that on 60% or more of the behaviors that are positive breeding behaviors being exhibited towards one male or the other. I marked them as preferred or not preferred. I didn't ask them to change their breeding plan in either way. I just kind of was hoping that I'd get a equal distribution, right? It's kind of a coin toss, hopefully, whether or not the preferred or the non-preferred was actually introduced for breeding. And I got more preferreds introduced for breeding, but it did turn out that we had enough of a sample size. And if the female was mated to the preferred male, reproductive success, like breeding and offspring production, increased to about 80%. And the non-preferred males, reproductive success, those pairings were more like in the 20%. So
that's huge. Wow.
It was a huge difference. Based off of those findings, we actually took it back to the scientific advisory group for that species survival plan and, sort of suggested that potentially we just go into a free mate choice sort of setting with them and build these large enclosures and still put the genetics that we wanted together, but more, hey, this whole group could breed together and we'd be fine. And then this whole group could breed together and we'd be fine. So we started 2 of those. And now the program has exploded. They're now breeding like bunnies, which they weren't before.
Good for them.
And I think the last I heard, they were producing about 800 kits per year, which we weren't even getting a replacement population. So we were just slowly losing them under the traditional breeding methods. So, yeah.
So what about putting a female with her preferred male could have translated into that huge difference? Like what's different about a mating with a preferred male or the female physiology when she's mating with a preferred male that could have resulted in that big of an impact?
Yeah, I mean, the first biggie, right, is whether or not you like the preferred male enough to even copulate with them or have sex with them, right? Because if you don't do that, you never have a baby.
Right. Okay. That's the first.
What they're choosing on, I have no idea. Many scientists have tried to spend their entire life sort of trying to pinpoint the exact smell or, right, there's a lot of MHC research out there right now.
Just to remind our listeners, that's major histocompatibility complex. We've talked about that before, but it's part of the immune system that's hypervariable. And so often in many species, individuals will choose mates who have a different MHC than themselves.
Right. And the theory is that they have a more disparate immune system, which would then be conferred, the combination of your immune system and this very different immune system would then be conferred on the immune system of your offspring, and they would be better able to survive. Everyone studied things from size of antlers, size of body, I mean, all sorts of things, right? I think it's more complicated than that, just like it is in humans. We don't really choose on just one aspect ever.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of a
So you don't
combination.
even, in this case, you don't even need to know what they're choosing. You just need to know that they have that
Yeah,
choice, and that results
that
in
they
better.
have the choice.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
there's a lot of zoo studies on just choice, even just food choice and how much that improves well-being. So you can imagine that, sort of extending that to a more lifelong choice may actually have a very large impact. But yeah, I kind of say, hey, if we never get that breeding, it really doesn't matter evolutionarily wise. If you never produce offspring in these programs, you might as well have not existed. I mean, I guess that's true for anything, right?
Yeah.
If we don't produce offspring, then through the genetics, we disappear from evolution.
Yeah, except for through your relatives, I guess, if you help your
Right.
relatives to
Right. If
reproduce.
you have
Yeah. Yes.
offspring, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Circling back, so for the females who did mate with the non-preferred males, are there any post-copulatory processes that are known to occur in that species? Like, would females be more likely to abort offspring that were sired by non-preferred males or anything like that?
Yep. And almost every species I have, if you had a breeding in the non-preferred, so the first step is the breeding, right? And then the second step is whether or not you produce offspring. And there's what they call post-copulatory prezygotic, they think choice. Again, this is not very well understood, but theoretically, females may be able to quote unquote choose what sperm get through or how well they fertilize the egg, or potentially abort the fetus if they do produce a zygote. Yeah, so there may be these mechanisms that females have in that sort of post-copulatory phase that they use to choose quote unquote a male. So the pygmy rabbits, I believe, were pretty, I mean, go read my paper. I can't really remember. It's been about 20
We'll
years.
post it to the website.
But if I recall, there was a pretty distinct, so copulatory success was pretty low, right? Like 20%. And I think by the time they got to offspring, I only had like one litter that even survived or was produced. And then not many of them survived to 1 year. So that was sort of the next phase. And again, that's a big question mark in terms of what's happening between copulation and fertilization. Maybe if they're non-preferred, maybe the male's sperm quality is actually just lower and somehow the female can sense that, right? Maybe there's that. Maybe they are actively not as excited. Some researchers have I've researched this a little bit in giant pandas. So when we do artificial insemination versus the natural mating, we get a lower success rate a lot of times. And, some people think that that's potentially because your body, during those courtship and breeding sessions, the female body gets sort of prepped and the fallopian tubes move eggs better, or right, like all these different sort of mechanisms that may be in play there. But something about it potentially preps your body to be ready to accept a fertilized egg. So the first stage is copulation, and then getting to that second stage of actually producing a baby seems to be the next very large reduction in reproductive success measurements. But in the giant panda, I carried it further to sort of maternal behaviors.
From the pygmy rabbits, did you go to pandas from there? Was that next?
Yeah, so I managed to get pretty well published on that paper, for a master's, it felt like. And we were lecturing at the San Diego Zoo, which of course has pandas, and some of, the best giant panda biologists in the country. And so when I was lecturing there, I kind of made a joke about how I had thought of this idea on giant pandas a couple of years ago, but I had written people and no one was interested. And the guy that I had written, Ron Swaysgood from the San Diego Zoo, was actually in the room and kind of laughed about it. And we made jokes back and forth about it. And he's like, "Did I write you back?" And I was like, "You did not.
You did not.
You did not write me back." But when I returned home, he and David Shepardson and I talked about potentially having the PhD under both of them. So I would stay at the Oregon Zoo, but Ron Swaysgood would mentor me in China and on the giant pandas. And so I headed to China and did my PhD with the San Diego Zoo and Oregon Zoo and Portland State University and the CCRCGP, which is a super mouthful for the Chinese Conservation and Research Center for the Giant Panda. And I spent the next 4 years there collecting the research and then a year writing it up. But there I wanted to concentrate on both male and female mate choice. So I added in the male portion. We wanted to see if this was sort of a reproducible finding across taxa, right? Because if it works for one, I mean, that's a lagomorph. So we're working in rabbits for the Columbia Basin pygmy rabbit. You know, does it work on these solitary carnivores a little bit more?
Solitary carnivores? Are pandas carnivores?
Well, I guess they have the carnivore dentitia. Yeah,
they're right.
Yes. We should probably say different. Yeah. Carnivores turned herbivore.
Right. Yeah. So not carnivores in terms of what they eat, but part of that group of organisms.
Very, very specialized. Yeah. Non-herbivores now because they eat bamboo entirely, but come from like a carnivore, sort of evolution. So these solitary large bears, right? And did that work in them as well? And were we seeing the same thing? So I performed that study, and this time we actually measured both the male and the female behavior towards each other, and we actually set it up. They had these large, it was like a U-type setting where it was male, female, male, female, male, female, male, female. So we looked at the breeding and we tried to set up as best we could, you know, the first and second preferred breeding partners for that
in terms
female
of
genetics.
Okay.
Yeah. So the recommended breeding partners in terms of genetics. So male 1 and male 2 would usually be next to the female. And so as we did that, I again just measured the behavior, and we found, funny enough, very similar numbers. And I'm finding that in all the taxa I've measured is that basically once you breed to a preferred, you get up to that 80%, that like right around 80%, anywhere from 75% up to, 85% reproductive success, copulation success.
And offspring production, or not necessarily offspring?
Offspring production, you get a little bit more into the 50-50 range for them, but that's much better than the non-preferreds. Right. So you are getting, at each step, you lose success. And that was kind of another thing. We don't really know those numbers in the wild very well, even, right? So I do have that come up a lot. What is quote unquote success? How can we say that they are unsuccessful when we don't even know what the wild percentage is of breeding or the wild percentage of cubbing is? And I'm like, we don't. We now know it for captivity, but we still really don't.
Right. But we know that this is better than it was, right?
Right. And
Maybe
that we're
birds.
Right. We call it adaptive management. So we're adaptively managing. We find a problem in the conservation breeding program. We're hoping to make enough babies to sustain the population so that we have a reservoir population is what we call it. So sort of that reservoir for the wild population in case that population goes extinct. And then ideally you're getting into excess production so you can start supplementing the wild population.
By releasing those captive
By releasing the extra quote unquote offspring into the wild. Yeah. So we did that, and it turns out mutual mate choice was the best. So if both the male and the female preferred each other, we actually got a lot closer to that 100% mark of them breeding. Yeah. If they were non-preferred, we were literally sitting at 0%. So, if they were just sort of what I would call behaviorally incompatible, right? You're like, not if you're the last panda on Earth. And that's pretty much how they felt.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Yeah.
they're given 1 or 2 breeding opportunities a year, and
Yeah.
sometimes they would still refuse. And that happens. That was pretty exciting because if we had the mixed pairs, so either the female or the male preferred, we got into the 50%. So it very clearly demarcated out, right, that non-preferreds, you're getting a 0% copulation rate. You get about a coin toss, right? If another one of the individuals can convince the other individual once they're actually introduced that, hey,
Right.
you actually do want to meet with me, you got like that 50% copulation rate, and then you got the extra bump if you were preferred. So both individuals liked each other. So that, as you can imagine, since it was giant pandas and it was sex, I got accepted into Nature Communications, which
Wow.
maybe non-scientists wouldn't really know, but as my second
Yeah.
publication is a pretty high
Yeah,
publication.
it's a very prestigious journal.
It was a very prestigious journal, and I was suddenly thrown into Reuters and National Geographic
Oh
and
wow.
Smithsonian and New York Times interviews. And so, yeah, that's how that took
Yeah.
off.
So into the area of science
Yeah.
communication and really the importance of this work. Yeah.
Right,
Very
right,
cool.
yeah.
Were there some males that were especially popular among the females or vice versa?
Yes, that's what
Oh,
I was
okay.
just gonna
Oh,
say.
sorry.
So,
Sorry.
no,
Jumped the
no,
gun.
it's like perfect. You set me up. Segue. Yeah. So, for example, Lulu was the popular breeding male of my time. And I forget the exact percentages in the stud book, but I think they can track something crazy like 60% of all giant pandas to him in some way.
Whoa.
So he was very highly represented in the population, and others we tried to get to breed and really wanted represented in the population, and they just would never breed. And we didn't really know why. And both males and females. So I started doing my postdoc on what if we give howdies to males right before breeding? Maybe some males, like Lulu, don't mind being in captivity and breeding in that environment, right? They're exhibitionists, if you will. Right, they can breed in
Yeah.
front of humans, and they're not bothered,
It's
and they
not a
have enough
problem.
sexual
Yeah.
motivation that they're just going to do it. But maybe some males don't have, I was thinking at the time that male competition may give a testosterone boost. There was some wild studies
Some
sort of around
physiological change.
maybe
Yeah.
there's some physiological thing they need
Yeah.
to be successful. And so we conducted that study, and it was an extension of the dichotomous choice test, I would say. So same setup, male, female, male. The only difference is I would measure the female's behavior, then I would move her away from the males inside to a closed off pen, and I would let the males in next to each other. So I'd move one into the pen. We switched sides to hopefully kind of compensate for who was getting moved into the female pen. Then we measured the male quote unquote competition, which was just a howdy through the bars, moved that male back, and then moved the female back in between, and then measured behaviors again. We found that the male competition did indeed increase what we would call like sexual motivation sort of behaviors from both the males across the board. They were more motivated to interact with the female and tried to solicit her a lot more after the male competition. But the most fascinating thing I found, which we don't have very many sample sizes, but 3 of the males had been non-breeders but had been given the chance to breed during the 5 years of my PhD. 3 of those males that underwent the competition then went on to breed and became successful
Really?
breeders. Yeah.
That's
So
amazing. That is such
yeah,
a,
so I mean, it's an
yeah.
N of 3, but
I know, but I feel like I see that, like I work mostly with insects and I see that all the time. Like a male will be not interacting with a female and you add one more male in, like that's the
yep,
only thing that's changed. And all of a sudden, all this mating activity happens with everybody. And yeah,
yep,
it's really
yeah.
incredible the effect of having another male
Yeah,
present.
and
Yeah.
it turns out the giant pandas need that too, potentially.
Mhm.
So all the copulations were higher for that group. So we had that group, and then that was our experimental group, the ones that got male competition. But we had a whole nother group who sort of went through the same process, but they were never given the move to be next to the other male. The
Right.
female was just kind of moved in for 30 minutes and then moved back out for 30
As a
minutes
control. Yeah.
as the control. And the experimental did much better breeding wise as well, and cut
Sweet.
production too. So
Wow.
again, these things have evolved. These systems have evolved through so many years, right?
Yeah, but it's really an
Yeah.
evolutionary approach to conservation breeding. And it's amazing, really using the science of what we know about sex and reproduction to make these programs more successful. I love it. Very
Yeah,
interesting.
it feels good to work on it, definitely.
So
I mean,
what's the
we've performed
yeah.
it in now butterflies, iguanas, and a
Uh-huh.
kikiki, which is a bird. And in each one of those species, the mate preference and mate choice, just giving choice, has sometimes not increased it as much. So the iguanas and the butterflies were not quite as much as sort of the mammal systems were, but the birds and the mammals all had quite a bit of increase. So
Interesting.
nice to, yeah.
Very cool. And now you said you're working also on otters and painted dogs as well?
Right. So now I've kind of switched a little bit to multi-institutional research where we're now trying to identify the species, the national zoos, like the American zoos, I should say, manage all of their breeding programs as one organization, quote unquote. So they have what we call species survival plans or SSPs, and all the individuals in every zoo in the United States of elephants, for example, or I'll give you the North American river otter, we analyze them and choose which pairs should mate every year. And that may look like moving a pair from facility to, a female in Oregon to a male in New York or something. So we manage them that way. So we manage them as a large population. And so the larger zoos are part of AZA, which is the American Zoo Association, and they cooperate in the background and provide all of their data for these breeding programs. And so now we've done it for enough years that we have enough data that we can retroactively look at which animals aren't breeding successfully, like which species in general aren't breeding successfully, or which ones may be having sort of problems. And that's what we did. We identified that weirdly the North American river otter, which you'd think we have a lot of information about and know how they do things in the wild, they are not breeding very well in the zoos. So we're trying to figure out why that is. And we're looking more at like larger picture. So, what kind of river systems do you have? Is it running water? Is it stagnant water? Do you have a waterfall? How large is the exhibit? How do you socially manage those animals? So is it just a one-on-one otter situation, or do you have a group of otters? That kind of thing. So lots of sort of broad sweeping questions about the facilities to see if we can then pick one of those. Maybe something flags to us, maybe something will come out and we can focus in on a research study that helps determine if it's that specific aspect or not.
So you can find where to focus your efforts. That's awesome.
Right.
This has just been such a pleasure. I love the science of sex, whether it's useful or not, but to hear how it's going towards the conservation of endangered species, I'm just thrilled to learn about this. So thank you so much.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for having me. I love sharing my work. I definitely, in academia, it was always frowned upon to be doing quote unquote applied science. And I really hope that's shifting, because why ask the questions if we're not going to apply it somehow to help the natural world sometimes? I love science for the sake of science on my own, but I do also think that we have so many pressing problems in today's world that might as well. It's important.
And thank you all for listening. Thanks also to our production team, Isabel Espinoza, Lane Patton, and Daphne Trilliana. The music used in this episode is from I Don't Smoke by the Mythical Score Society.